Picture the most famous warrior in Western history. Not Caesar, not Alexander, not Achilles. Leonidas. You know the image. Every culture on earth knows the image.
The broad chest, the sculpted abdominals, the crimson cloak snapping in the wind, the jaw that could shatter stone, the voice that could stop armies. The man who looked at 1,000,000 Persian soldiers and said with perfect calm, "Come and take them." The man who stood at Thermopylae with 300 soldiers and held the gates of the known world. Schools teach him as the definition of courage. Hollywood turned him into a god. He appears on military insignia, in motivational quotes, on the walls of fitness centers and barracks from Athens to Arlington. He is the template for every fictional hero who chooses impossible odds over comfortable survival. Here is the problem with that portrait. Every single layer of it is a fabrication. Not a slight exaggeration, not a romanticized retelling. A systematic, calculated, institutionally enforced lie, maintained by a society that needed its soldiers to believe the lie in order to function. And the man at the center of that lie, he did not just benefit from it, he enforced it. He was the lie in human form. This is the story that the statue was built to prevent you from seeing. The story of what Leonidas actually was, what the Spartan system actually did, and what it cost the human beings who passed through it. By the time we are done, you will not be able to look at that portrait the same way again. If you have ever suspected that the history you were taught was incomplete, you are about to discover how right you were. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are just getting started on what the textbooks refuse to show. The surface layer first. The visual lie. Stand in front of any sculpture of a Spartan warrior. The ones you have seen in museums, the ones they use in documentaries, the ones reproduced 1,000 times in popular culture. What do you see? Perfect musculature, symmetric features, an idealized human body operating at the absolute peak of physical possibility. Now, here is what you need to understand about those sculptures. They were not portraits. They were state propaganda, executed in bronze and marble. They depicted not what Spartan soldiers looked like, but what the Spartan state needed its enemies to believe Spartan soldiers looked like. The difference between those two things is the size of the entire deception.
The actual physical condition of a Spartan soldier at any given point in his life was the product of a system designed not to produce health, but to produce a very specific and very narrow form of functional capacity, purchased at a biological cost that the sculptures were built to conceal. Think about what that means. The most recognizable physical image in military history, the template that every culture uses when it wants to depict the ideal warrior, built not from observation, but from strategic dishonesty. The portraits were the first layer of the lie. Now let's go to the layer underneath. Leonidas was born into the agoge. It was not a military school in any sense you would recognize. It did not have a structured curriculum with qualified instructors and graduated challenges. The agoge was a controlled trauma system running continuously from age 7, designed to eliminate everyone it could not use and to permanently reshape everyone who survived into something that would function reliably in a specific military context. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families. Not metaphorically separated, not sent to boarding schools with visiting days. Taken, removed from the family home and placed into the agoge, where they would remain for the next 13 years under conditions that modern psychiatry would classify without ambiguity as systematic child abuse. They slept on reeds they had to cut themselves from the Eurotas River, not beds, not pallets, reeds, which provided minimal insulation from the ground, absorbed moisture from the soil, and created a sleeping environment that most people today would reject as unsuitable for livestock. Their clothing allocation was a single garment per year, regardless of the season. Sparta sits at an elevation that produces genuine winters. The boys slept in their reeds, wearing their single garment in conditions cold enough to cause death in the underfed and the weak. This was not oversight, it was design. Their food was deliberately insufficient. Not challenging, not austere,
insufficient. They were maintained in a state of chronic caloric deficit that forced them to steal food to survive, and they were beaten severely if caught, not for stealing, but for being caught stealing.
The lesson was not do not steal. The lesson was do not get caught. The distinction matters enormously if you are trying to understand what kind of mind this system was building.
Think about what you are actually doing to a human brain when you subject it to this from age 7. You are not building discipline. You are not building mental toughness in any positive psychological sense.
You are building a trauma response architecture that mimics toughness on the outside while systematically dismantling the internal structures that allow a person to function in any context except the one the trauma prepared them for.
Modern trauma research is unambiguous about what chronic childhood stress does to the developing nervous system. It produces hypervigilance. It produces a blunted emotional response.
It produces a specific kind of functional competence under threat conditions that looks, from the outside, exactly what popular culture calls Spartan toughness.
And it produces a comprehensive inability to function outside threat conditions that popular culture carefully avoids mentioning. Leonidas did not survive the agoge because he was extraordinary.
He survived because he was the right combination of physical durability and psychological compliance to absorb what the system was doing to him without breaking in ways the system could not use. The ones who broke in unusable ways are not in the history books. They lie in the ground beneath Sparta, unnamed. Here is what no textbook will ever tell you. The agoge was not a training program. It was a filter. Its purpose was not to create warriors. Its purpose was to destroy everyone the Spartan state could not use, and to do it efficiently, using the bodies of the survivors as the instrument of that destruction.
The older boys ran the younger ones. Senior agoge cohorts had near total authority over junior ones, with violence as the legitimate and expected enforcement mechanism.
When a boy was beaten in the agoge, it was not a punishment delivered by an adult authority figure. It was violence delivered by a slightly older child who had himself been beaten in exactly the same way, and was now, in the only social position available to him, replicating the system that had shaped him. This is not incidental to the agoge. It is the mechanism. You are not traumatized by an adult.
You are traumatized by someone who was almost your peer, who was traumatized the same way, who now holds power over you, and who will lose that power the moment you age out of the cohort he controls.
The system creates trauma perpetuation without requiring a malicious authority at the top. It runs on its own momentum, generation after generation, using each class of damaged boys to damage the next one. Leonidas was inside this machine for 13 years.
Let's go deeper. The crypteia. If you have heard of this, you know it only by the sanitized version. The exercise where advanced agoge graduates were sent into the countryside to test their skills. Here is what actually happened. Select graduates of the agoge, deemed the most capable, were sent out into the Laconian countryside alone at night, armed with daggers, with explicit state authorization to kill helots, the enslaved agricultural population that Sparta depended on entirely for its food supply. Not enemy soldiers, not criminals, helots. The people who grew Sparta's food, tended Sparta's land, and enabled the Spartan citizen class to spend its entire existence focused on military preparation, instead of the agricultural labor that every other civilization in Greece was required to perform. The crypteia killed the strongest and most capable helots, the ones most likely to organize resistance. It was targeted terror. State-sanctioned assassination of enslaved people, performed by adolescent boys as a military rite of passage, designed to maintain psychological control over a population that outnumbered the Spartan citizen class by a ratio historians estimate at anywhere from 7-1 to 15-1. Think about that ratio. Sparta's entire military structure, everything it sacrificed, everything it put its citizens through, was in significant part a response to the existential terror of being surrounded by an enslaved majority that would destroy the state the moment it lost its fear of the Spartan soldier. Leonidas did not just tolerate this system, he was its product, and as king, he was its enforcer and its symbolic head. The portrait on the museum wall, the perfect warrior king, the defender of civilization.
The reality beneath it, a man shaped by a trauma machine who enforced a terror apparatus against an enslaved population, whose entire identity was built around a social order maintained through systematic violence against the people who fed him. This is not an argument about whether Thermopylae was real or whether the courage displayed there was genuine. It was real. The courage was genuine. It is an argument about what that courage was in service of and what it cost, not the Persians, but the Spartans themselves, and the helots whose names history never recorded.
Now the middle layers, the biological reality. The Spartan diet in the agoge was built around a dish called melis zomos, black broth. Ancient sources from outside Sparta described it with consistent revulsion. Plutarch records a Sybarite visitor who tried it and concluded, flatly, that he now understood why Spartans did not fear death.
The implication was not a compliment. The broth was made from boiled pork, vinegar, salt, and blood. This specific combination produces a smell that contemporary accounts describe as deeply unpleasant, a fermented metallic odor that saturates clothing and hair.
Boys in the agoge smelled of it continuously because it was their primary sustenance, because they had no means to bathe regularly, and because the reed sleeping mats they lay on absorbed and retained the odor from their bodies as they slept.
The Spartan warrior that popular culture presents as gleaming bronze and crimson wool smelled in daily life of blood broth, unwashed skin, and the dampness of riverside reeds. This is not a detail. This is the ambient reality inside which every moment of the agoge occurred. Every lesson, every beating, every military drill, every moment of the psychological conditioning that turned boys into soldiers, all of it happened inside that smell. History books do not mention the smell. They never do. The smell is the first casualty of every mythology.
The nutritional consequences of the agoge diet were not trivial. Chronic caloric restriction during adolescence produces measurable and lasting effects. Reduced bone density at peak formation periods, suppressed immune function, and hormonal disruption during the developmental window when hormonal patterns are established for life.
The Spartan soldier you see in the sculpture, fully realized musculature, maximum bone structure, peak human physical capacity.
The Spartan boy in the agoge, chronically underfed, hormonally disrupted, sleeping on wet reeds and insufficient clothing, healing from beatings in an environment with no medical care, consuming a diet that modern nutritional science would classify as definitionally inadequate for a developing human being. These are not the same person.
The sculpture is a projection of what the system needed people to believe it produced. The agoge was the biological reality of what it actually produced, and the gap between those two things was maintained at great cost through the careers of every soldier who emerged from it. Leonidas survived to become king. He was living proof that the system worked in the narrow sense that it could produce a functional military commander from materials that most societies would have classified as abuse victims. If you find that this changes something about how you see this period, good.
That's the point. Like this video so others can see what their history books hid from them. The behavioral layer now. What the system did to the mind. Spartan soldiers were forbidden from showing pain. Not discouraged, forbidden.
The social enforcement mechanism for this prohibition was comprehensive and continuous. A soldier who showed pain, through expression, through sound, through any behavioral indicator, was marked. Not punished formally, marked socially, which in a society as small and closed as Sparta's citizen class was in many respects worse.
The result was a population trained, through 13 years of systematic reinforcement, to suppress every normal human response to injury and distress. Think about what you are actually producing when you do this to a person. You are not producing someone who does not feel pain. The nervous system cannot be trained not to feel pain. You are producing someone who has learned, through years of conditioning, to dissociate their conscious experience from their physical state, to maintain a behavioral exterior that does not reflect the biological interior. This is not toughness. This is a dissociative adaptation. It is the same mechanism produced by childhood trauma across cultures and centuries, and modern psychology catalogs its long-term consequences in considerable detail. Difficulty with intimate relationships, inability to accurately assess one's own physical condition, susceptibility to injuries that go unrecognized and untreated, psychological rigidity that functions in known high-stress environments and collapses outside them. The Spartan soldier system produced, at scale, a population of men with these characteristics, and then celebrated the characteristics as virtues, while the structural consequences of those characteristics remained invisible. Leonidas, by the time he reached the kingship, had spent decades in this system. His behavioral suppression was not an act. It was not performance. It was the only self he had access to. The agoge had built a man who genuinely could not, at a neurological level, perform the full range of human behavioral responses. The portrait shows a man in control of himself. The reality was a man who had no access to large portions of himself, because the system that built him had removed those portions as architectural decisions. Now, the layer most people never reach, the court around him, the systemic complicity. Sparta always had two kings simultaneously. The dual kingship was a power-balancing mechanism, but it created something else, a court structure in which the fiction of perfect warrior kingship had to be maintained by everyone in proximity to both kings at all times. The Spartan Gerousia, the Council of Elders, was composed of men who had themselves passed through the agoge, who had themselves performed or overseen the krypteia, who had themselves spent careers in the behavioral suppression system. They were not outside observers capable of perceiving the dysfunction. They were the dysfunction, aged and institutionally formalized. Foreign ambassadors noted things that Spartan citizens were trained not to see.
Herodotus, who was not Spartan and therefore not subject to the social enforcement mechanisms, records details about Spartan behavior and social structure that the Spartan historical tradition, such as it was, Spartans were deliberately educated in a culture that distrusted written records, simply does not preserve. This is not accidental. A culture that does not write things down cannot be fact-checked. The absence of Spartan written records is not a historical accident. It is the result of a deliberate policy. Spartans did not produce written histories because written histories create accountability.
The oral tradition they maintained was curated, controlled, and shaped by the same institutional forces that shaped everything else in the society. What Leonidas thought about his own condition, his own history, his own system, we cannot know. We have no access to his inner experience. What we can know is that he lived inside a total institution. That total institutions do not produce individuals capable of stepping outside them to evaluate them, and that the man standing at Thermopylae was not a free actor making a sovereign choice. He was the final output of a machine that had been running since he was 7 years old. The monument honors the output. It does not show the machine, the deepest layer, the selection at Thermopylae. Here is the detail that every account of Thermopylae mentions and none of them explains. Leonidas did not choose his 300 soldiers from the best fighters available to him. He chose soldiers who had already produced male heirs. Read that again. Not the strongest, not the most experienced, not the most decorated. Men who had sons. The conventional historical interpretation, this was a death mission, and Leonidas wanted men who had already secured the genetic continuity of Spartan bloodlines before they died. That interpretation is accurate, and it is also, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, one of the most disturbing things in the entire history of this story. What Leonidas was doing at Thermopylae was not a sacrifice. It was a managed expenditure of human material, planned with enough precision to account for biological succession before the expenditure was executed. These were not men who volunteered out of courage and happened to have sons. These were men selected in part on the basis of their reproductive output, because their lives were, within the Spartan accounting system, worth exactly the value of their military function minus the cost of their genetic replacement. The Spartan citizen was not a person within the Spartan system. He was a resource. He was allocated, maintained, managed, and when necessary, expended, according to the requirements of the state. Leonidas, as king, was the administrator of this allocation system. At Thermopylae, he exercised that administration with the precision that 13 years of agoge and a lifetime of institutional conditioning had prepared him to exercise.
The portrait shows a king who died for his men.
The reality shows a king who selected his men for death using our criteria that included their reproductive status, because the system he served had already determined that the battle would be lost and was calculating which human materials could most efficiently be expended in the losing of it. This is not a diminishment of the courage at Thermopylae. The courage was real. 300 men held an impossible position for 3 days and died doing it. It is a statement about what courage looks like when it has been institutionally produced, systematically maintained, and deployed in service of a system that classified the courageous people as agricultural equipment. The legacy.
The gap between the monument and reality. Today, Leonidas appears on the coat of arms of the Greek Special Forces. Replicas of the monument at Thermopylae stand in military academies and government buildings.
The phrase molon labe, come and take them, appears on firearms, patches, bumper stickers, and political rhetoric across the Western world. It is used in contexts ranging from military service to domestic policy debates. The 300 are referenced in leadership seminars, motivational content, sports contexts, and advertising campaigns. Leonidas is invoked to justify courage, sacrifice, resistance against impossible odds, and the virtue of choosing honor over survival. The man behind the monument, a product of systematic childhood trauma, who spent his adult life administering a terror apparatus against an enslaved population, who selected men for death based partly on whether they had already reproduced, who died in service of a social order that classified its own citizens as state property. These two versions of the same human being exist simultaneously in history. The monument was built to make you see only one of them. Now you have seen both. Here's the thing that should permanently change how you see this period. Sparta is not an aberration in the history of organized violence.
Sparta is the clearest example of what happens when a society, at the institutional level, that the production of a specific kind of human capacity is worth any biological and psychological cost to the human beings being produced. Every generation produces a Spartan system in some form. A machine that claims to build the best version of its participants while actually consuming them for the purposes of the institution. The machine always builds a monument to itself. The monument always looks like a portrait of a hero. The question the monument is designed to prevent you from asking, what did the machine look like from inside? You just spent the last several minutes inside it. You cannot unknow what you know now. Now you know what the portrait was hiding. You can never look at it the same way again. If you want more of the history they sanitized, the biology, the pathology, the institutional machinery behind the iconic image, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Which historical figure do you think is hiding the most behind their portrait? Which other mythology do you want us to dismantle? The list is longer than you would believe. The statues are still standing. We are going to keep showing you what they are standing on.